So we talked about the PS4's kernel being exploited and how people will start working on things like custom firmware and just furthering the hacking scene, since a big breakthrough was made with that PS4. And we kind of talked a little bit about it, touched on it a little bit, said this will probably happen at some point. When, I don't know. And then I also kind of talked about how PS2 emulation would be really cool, and I think that's something that will probably pop up at some point. Well, it already happened, and it didn't take long, a couple weeks maybe. And yes, we have the ability now, from what we've seen with different hackers who have kind of made this breakthrough, to not only back up, this is where things get very, very dicey for Sony, and they're going to have to look into this, to not only back up PS4 games, so you can technically start pirating games, which is very bad, but you can also play PS2 games, back up and load PS2 games, which is actually pretty cool. I think that's kind of interesting. However, this could also start to border on piracy with, say, Sony when it comes to games they're putting on their shop. So if you don't know, they do put PS2 games. I think they have, just over 50 PS2 games on their PlayStation Network that you can download and play. They really haven't made a lot of strides to add more recently. I think they maybe put 10 up in 2017, so last year, which wasn't a lot. But they are at least putting more up, and they are working on it. Now, they're nowhere near what Microsoft has been doing with their backwards compatibility, something we'll get into after we go over the details here. Just know it looks like the PS2 emulator that's on the PS4 right now, as we discovered back in 2015, is more full-fledged than we originally thought. And this was originally reported on Elo Trelato. I'm sorry I tried with that name. But they reported that this had happened. It was a breakthrough in the hacking community after that kernel was exploited. And then they go on to talk about how these hackers are now loading up things like PS2 games, specifically Shinobi and Klonoa 2. I remember Klonoa 2 did not work on PS3 systems that had like that 70 or 80% compatibility with emulation, specifically when they got away from the 60 gigabyte that actually had the chip on there, the Emotion Engine chip built onto the board. They removed that and used software emulation. I believe Klonoa 2 was one that did not work on there. So it seems like the emulator that is built and actually put into the PS4, it's been in there since we discovered it in 2015. It looks like it's actually ready to play any game from what they're seeing here. They're testing several games. They're testing Shinobi, as we heard, and then Klonoa 2, and they both seem to work fine. In fact, they seem to up-res to better resolutions and play with good frame rates. So far, so good with that. Now, the big problem here that we're going to run into is piracy, as I just said, because according to, again, this tech blog, you can just back up games. Like, you can just back them up completely through FTP, which lets you transfer it to something like a computer, and then it decrypts it to a package or a PKG file, and then you can send it back and just install it on your PS4. Now, there are some barriers that are problematic for hackers right now, which maybe they'll try to do things around this, but so far, Sony seems to be at least mostly safe, because the last firmware that they're using this on is 4.05. The last game that shipped with 4.05 is Gravity Rush 2, a game where, well, servers are getting shut off for because it's a little older now, and so they don't care as much about it, but it's not a new game. And most of us are on newer firmware, over 5, and we're coming up on 5.5 now with beta testers starting to pop up, and you can send your name in to get beta testing going on. So it's not going to affect you if you've played your PS4 or been online with your PS4 in the last few months. Now, this is something that Sony still needs to be very vigilant about. As we've seen in the past, things like the PSP being the best example, hackers that really get into this and really get things figured out with one kernel start to move up the ladder to the next firmware and the next one, and it generally tends to be a chase, right? Sony puts out a new firmware, and the hackers chase and try to crack that one. Then Sony puts out another one, and it continues until the system stops getting active development or active security patches. That's the way it is. So, sure, someday the PS4 will probably be fully hacked to the point where Sony doesn't support it anymore. They don't put any kind of firmware out on it. Kind of like what happened with the Wii, as we saw with that, where it didn't get many system updates anymore, and the thing got hacked like crazy. And people still love hacking that system, but at this point, the PS4 is still in circulation. It's still Sony's main system, so they're gonna have to be careful. Because as these hackers start to do things like open up this system further to where it gets closer and closer to the current firmware, sure, you're not going to go online with it. I wouldn't expect you to go online and get destroyed by somebody in Call of Duty as like hacks running. It's still a problem, and so he's going to have to be very careful with this. Now, on the other side, the PS2 emulation has to be annoying people at this point. Now that we know that it seems to be compatible with pretty much every game that's been tested, and they're going to keep testing them. A lot of these will be tested over the next week, I can tell you that now. Pretty much they're just going to go out and get whatever game they can and try it out, out, because originally it was thought, okay, they're designing this emulator to run with specific games as they go. Like maybe certain games aren't compatible yet, but they will be. Maybe that Shinobi game wasn't compatible before, but they'll make it compatible when they eventually get there. I'm sure there's licensing issues, there's contracts, there's a lot of stuff to work on outside of the game itself to make sure everybody gets their piece of the pie, and, you know, everybody wants money, obviously, for a game that they have created. But it seems like Microsoft is doing much better when it comes to backwards compatibility, and Sony doesn't seem to care in the eyes of the fan. I mean, think about it. You could put in a 360 game or an original Xbox game into your Xbox, and it'll just load it up without you having to buy it on the shop. I'm not really sure why you can't do that with Sony's PS4 right now, considering it can read PS2 games and it can read PS1 games. I mean, there are CDs and there are DVDs. Sure, I understand maybe the PS3 just won't work because it was such a complicated mess with the cell processor, but how can you not emulate PS2 games to where you pop the disc in, as long as it's compatible, it's all on their list, sure, and then it downloads the game and you play it? Seems kind of anti-consumer there, and that's generally what happens when you break that far out in the front, in a lead. If they were neck and neck with Microsoft right now, and Microsoft was offering all these really cool backwards compatibility features and everything, I think Sony would have to at least work on that a little more, but they don't really need to. They have so many systems out there, and they're starting to become, or at least they were at one point, Nintendo seems to be challenging them more, and at least Microsoft is starting to some more as well. They were becoming more of the monopoly of the gaming home console world. So hopefully we'll see going forward here with the PS2 stuff. That's the thing that most interests me with this entire hacking scene, is the fact that PS2 games and PS2 emulation is absolutely a thing on the PS4, and we'll have to see how it does going forward, and really what games work on this, because they're going to try a lot of them. And if we find out that this emulator is full-fledged and it's ready to go and it can play any PS2 games, there's going to be a lot of questions kind of asked in Sony's direction going forward here by consumers, probably even by outlets, press outlets and everything too. Maybe we'll get some answers about it going forward as to why you can't put a PS2 disc in, why you can't put a PS1 disc in and just get the image and start playing it. Sure, they can say, money, but Microsoft does it. So what's the deal there? You only put, a little more than 10 games on the shop last year? I mean, it doesn't sound like money is that big of a deal to them if they're not putting that many out and using some of their older games. But hey, I guess we'll find out going forward if they have any plans on doing that towards the end of its lifespan. Yeah, guys, that's going to do it for today. Let me know what you think about the PS4 hacking scene that has all of a sudden just taken off. All they needed was that kernel exploit, it seems, and they're going to keep pushing forward. So it's going to be, like I said, it's going to be that chase. But let me know what you think about really the PS2 emulation being, from what we've seen so far, just compatible with all the games they're testing. So I'm going to be curious to see if they really get anything else out of this, if there is a homebrew community that pops up, or if it just gets hacked like crazy and just all of these games start getting pirated. That would be a problem, and I hope Sony can solve that. Let me know what you guys think down below, and I'll see you next time.